Hello and welcome to Indian Standard Time, a show that speaks to global thinkers and global leaders, to people who have made their mark on the sands of time. Today I'm in conversation with Kishore Mahbubani, the Dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy of the National University of Singapore. Singapore's noted diplomat and thinker, indeed widely recognized as a global thinker and often called the muse of the Asian century. Professor Mahbubani, welcome to Rajya Sabha TV.
Happy to be here.
I'd like to start by asking you your name. You're clearly of Indian origin, but you're Singaporean. But related to that is a question on the riots that took place in Singapore in December, in which one Bangladeshi was killed, several Indians were injured in the little India enclave that you have in Singapore. What was the reason for those riots? And considering Singapore is this perfect place, it's perhaps the richest country in the world. How does this happen in a country like yours?
Well, let me first of all explain my origins. My parents grew up in Hyderabad, Sindh, which is now in Pakistan.
Okay.
And when partition took place in 1947, they came to Singapore. And I was born in Singapore in 1948, so I've lived there for 65 years.
So you're a Sindhi whose parents migrated from Pakistan to Singapore.
That's right.
So no Indian sort of diversion on the way, is it?
There was actually. They spent some time in Mumbai on the way to Singapore.
Okay.
So they did have spent, and all my relatives were in Calcutta and Mumbai. So I used to come to India frequently as a young person. But you mentioned the riots, and you are absolutely right. That was an aberration. Singapore has had a track record of being one of the most peaceful and prosperous states in the world. But what happened in some ways was not surprising, because there has been a surge of foreign workers coming to Singapore, including foreign workers from South Asia, from India, from Bangladesh.
Okay.
And they tend to congregate in what is called the Little India area on the weekends. And then on one Sunday, what happened was that one unfortunately drunk worker tried to board the bus and was refused permission. And then he decided to chase the bus, unfortunately, and in the process fell down and fell under the bus.
A little bit, like something that would happen in India or in other parts of South Asia, except not knowing that Singapore is different. So would you then describe this as a clash of cultures, I hate to say clash of civilizations, but certainly of identities perhaps, or cultural differences?
No, actually it was none of that. It was just a group of workers who were tired, who had been drinking a lot, and who went on a mini rampage. Fortunately, as you know, only one person was killed, and in general the damage was limited. And I actually think in some ways that event will serve as a wake-up call for Singapore, to remind Singaporeans that when you bring in lots of foreign workers, you bring in lots of challenges also.
Okay.
And I have no doubt that since Singapore has one of the best systems of governance in the world, one of the best public sectors.
Very high rates of inequality.
Yes.
Perhaps one of the most unequal places in the world as well.
Well, the Gini coefficient is quite high.
Which is the rate of inequality.
That's rate of inequality, but at the same time, we have the highest rate of home ownership in the world.
Okay.
About 90% of the citizens live in homes that they own.
So even poor people have their own homes.
So yes, even relatively poor people have their own homes, and the social safety nets that we have to take care of people at the bottom are quite strong. There are no homeless people in Singapore. There are no starving people in Singapore. But the inequality is rising as part of a global trend, because as you know, with globalization, the top levels of Singapore have to now compete with the top people in London and New York and Tokyo.
Okay.
So we have to pay them salaries comparable to London, Tokyo, New York. So which means that people at the top are earning the very top of global salaries, and the people at the bottom are earning Southeast Asian salaries. And that explains the inequality.
But Professor Mahbubani, you talked about how there was the social contract, if you like, that prevails in Singapore. So you have very rich people, but the poor people are not homeless, they don't live on the streets. The state does look after them.
Yes.
Now, how does that cohere with your criticism of India, where you say that that the Indian government, by giving food subsidies to India's poor. Now, after all, isn't that in a sense what Singapore is doing? And you yourself have talked about how when you, as a young child, as a child of poor parents, you went to school in Singapore and you were given free meals or subsidized meals by the Singaporean state. Now, if India is doing the same thing, why would that be critical on your part?
No, I certainly support aid for the poor. And since I myself, as you say, was put in a special feeding program, I know the difference it made. The only reason why I succeeded in life was because I was given bursaries and scholarships, and without those I would never have gone to university and would never have done well.
So the state played a very important role.
The state played a very important role. But at the same time, since you compare India and Singapore, the big difference between India and Singapore is that we've always had budgetary surpluses, and we've never had a budget deficit.
Okay, let's talk about in India. I don't want to compare it necessarily with Singapore.
Since you made the comparison with Singapore.
I know, but I'm talking about your own experience, your own personal experience, and the role of the state, the way the state intervened in your country, in Singapore, as well as in your personal life. And why would you be critical of the way the Indian state intervenes in the lives of people, but you would much rather say that there should be cash subsidies instead of food subsidies?
Well, I certainly think there should be aid for the poor, but I think the best way actually to help the poor in any country is to have strong economic growth. And as you know, what has been slowing down India's economic growth in recent years are the concerns about your budgetary deficits. And I think this is where the government has got to make very painful decisions. When you serve in government, you realize you have to have trade-offs. You can't do everything that you want to do.
Okay.
You have a limited budget and you have to allocate it accordingly. And certainly I support food aid for the poor and so on and so forth. But at the same time, when you do that, then you have to get rid of other subsidies that ensure that you don't get too big a budgetary deficit. And frankly, you know, I say that the country that has the biggest potential in the entire world is India.
Okay, and why do you say that?
Well, very simply, you know, the most competitive human laboratory in the world is probably the United States of America, because you get the best minds from all over the world rushing to study in American universities and staying on to work in America. And in this most competitive human laboratory in the world, you would have thought that the most successful ethnic group might be the Koreans or the Japanese or the Chinese or the Jews, right? Everyone thinks these are the most hardworking people in the world.
Right.
Guess what? The most successful ethnic community in the most competitive human laboratory in the world is the ethnic Indian community.
And how did that happen?
That's a remarkable achievement. So one statistic which I give in an article which I published in a book called Reimagining India by McKinsey, I say that if the average Indian in India could reach the per capita, half the per capita income of the average Indian in America, what you would have in India is a GNP that is not $2 trillion, but $25 trillion,
so what's
more
the
than
difference?
10 times larger.
So what's the difference then? What is it that the Indian in America does that the Indian in India cannot do?
Well, that's exactly, you know, the question that Deng Xiaoping asked when he took power in 1978. He said, why is it that Chinese are succeeding everywhere else in the world, but not succeeding in China?
Okay.
Then his answer was, well, clearly our system is wrong. And so, as you know, he transformed his system, and he went from the centrally planned state-run economics to a more free market economic system. And as a result of that, China has delivered the fastest growing economy in the world for over 30 years now. So in the same way, I think the question that India needs to ask is, what does it need to change in its economic system to allow the natural entrepreneurial abilities of Indians to succeed in India?
Okay, Professor Mahbubani, before you answer that, I'm going to take a very quick break. We are going to take a very quick break, but don't go away. We'll be back very soon. Welcome back. You're watching Indian Standard Time with Kishore Mahbubani, the Dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at the National University of Singapore and one of the world's best-known global thinkers. Professor Mahbubani, you're talking about a mantra, recipe for the success of Indians. But let me draw you away a little bit to your latest book on convergence, global convergence, and how you talk about, actually you paint quite an interesting picture of there being greater prosperity, fewer deaths in the last 100 years than ever before. And yet you have a marked distrust of the West vis-a-vis Asia. Am I correct?
Well, number one, I would say it's the last 30 years, not the last 100 years, that have been significant. In fact, we've seen greater progress in the last 30 years than the previous 300 years. And just to give you one statistic, in 1980, in purchasing power parity terms, United States had 25% of the global GNP, and China had 2.2%. Less than 10% of the United States. But in 3 to 4 years from now, China's will go up to 18% and United States will go down to 17%. So that's a remarkable transformation of world history. But your question about the distrust of the West is an important one, because it is a fact that many in the West feel uncomfortable about my writings. But it is ironic that I'm called anti-Western, because in my previous book, The New Asian Hemisphere, when I was asked to explain, and I have a chapter called Why is Asia Rising Now? My answer is that the reason why Asians are rising now is because they finally understood, absorbed, and are implementing 7 pillars of Western wisdom. And that's the reason why Asians are succeeding, because they're copying Western wisdom.
And that includes free markets, economics,
mastery of science and technology, rule of law, culture, meritocracy, culture of pragmatism.
So if you're applauding these Western pillars of wisdom, if you like,
how can I be anti-Western?
But then on the other hand, why are you accusing the West? And this has ruffled several feathers in the West.
Yes.
And you have been accusing. You've said some very negative things about America, for example, in its understanding of Asia.
Yeah, well, that's true, because you know I am an admirer of the West and what it has accomplished. But at the same time, the West likes to put itself up on a moral pedestal and likes to say that it is morally superior to other societies. I have just noticed an obvious fact, which is that West, like any other societies in the world, have double standards. They preach one thing and they do another thing. Let me give you a concrete example. For many years, you know, the State Department used to write reports on Singapore and human rights in Singapore. And they would say, how can Singapore allow detention without trial?
Give me an Indian example. Give me an Indian example.
Well, I mean, certainly in the case of, you saw in the recent Devyani Khobragade case,
the diplomat Devyani Khobragade, who was
the diplomat
withdrawn from
That's
New
right.
York.
And you know, I published an article on that, and I said that the US government would never allow any US government official to be arrested anywhere in the world. But they will arrest Indian officials in America. That's the kind of double standards that I referred to. But the most striking example, the most surprising example, you know, tomorrow, if the United States reintroduced slavery, there will be massive outrage in American society, right? Because the Americans will be shocked that slavery came back to the United States. But what's surprising is that when America reintroduced torture, there was no outrage in American society. And I asked myself, why not?
When did they do this?
Oh, in Guantanamo, in Abu Ghraib, in Guantanamo, and
no, there was huge reaction in America, and I think that sort of diminished George Bush's presidency quite significantly.
If there was a huge outrage, Congress would have taken action, and Congress would have said this is unacceptable. Congress endorsed the use of torture.
You know, in the Devyani Khobragade case, as you know, it became a big issue in India. But let me just play devil's advocate. The West is aggressively promoting democracy, civil liberties, human rights. Now, are you saying that those are not Asian values?
Is the West promoting democracy in Saudi Arabia? Was the West promoting democracy in Pakistan when they supported Ziaul Haq? Was the West promoting democracy when they supported President Mobutu of Zaire? You know, believe me, when it comes to foreign policy, and that was what my lecture was all about, no country puts values ahead of interests. Interests always trump values.
And on the other hand, the Americans...
So all I'm saying, I'm not saying that there's nothing wrong with the West. The West is just like any other normal society.
Okay.
It is neither morally superior nor morally inferior. It's morally normal.
And yet you say that it controls institutions like the United Nations, the IMF, the World Bank. So how do you rewrite that balance in a sense? How do you make the world more equal or more converging?
Well, that's actually, I'm glad you raised that question, because that's the whole purpose of my writings. And I tell the West, I speak to you as a friend of the West. The West represents only 12% of the world's population today, if you add up North America.
So the rest of us are 88%.
88%. And guess what? When it comes to selecting the head of the IMF, you must be a European.
That's right.
When it comes to selecting the head of the World Bank, you must be an American.
Yeah.
Now, excuse me, why do you disqualify 88% of the world's population from running two of the most important global institutions? Now, by the way,
and similarly in the Security Council, in the UN Security Council, which is a World War II institution,
yes,
would you say that it's high time that was revamped?
Yes, in fact, as I say, the West represents 12% of the world's population, even if you exclude Russia from the West, because Russia, as you know, is a somewhat ambiguous position.
Yeah.
If you add up United States, UK, and France, they control 60% of the 5 permanent seats. And when I serve as ambassador to the UN Security Council,
that's right,
I discovered that in theory the UN Security Council's got 15 members, 5 permanent and 10 elected. In practice, they have 5 members, the 5 permanent members, and the rest 10 of us are observers.
Okay.
We cannot control the council.
So how do you, Kishore Mahbubani, how do you revamp the Security Council, for example? India has been trying for the longest time being part of the G4. It doesn't really work. The Americans are simply disinterested. Yes. The Brits are not going to give up their seat, neither is France. Yeah. So how do countries like India, and by the way, the Chinese are not hugely in favor of India either.
You're absolutely right. Like ancient kings and dictators, those who sit on the throne do not want to vacate the throne voluntarily. This is a fact of life. But the problem in my new book, The Great Convergence, I explain that when India chose the G4 formula, it cannot get in because Germany and Japan cannot get in because Europe is already overrepresented. So I have a new 777 formula, and that will get India in. Okay,
hold your thought, Professor Mahbubani.
Yeah.
I'm going to take a very quick break, but I'll be back very soon. Welcome back. You're watching Indian Standard Time, and I'm in conversation with Kishore Mahbubani, the Dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy and renowned global thinker. Professor Mahbubani, tell me briefly about the 777 formula that you have for revamping the UN Security Council and for making it a more sort of egalitarian body.
I've proposed the 777 formula because I've been ambassador to the UN for over 10 years.
Sure.
I understand why Security Council reform has not happened so far, because all the formulas had a design flaw.
Okay.
And to put it very simply, the reason why, for example, Brazil couldn't get in because Argentina said, why not me? And when Germany was pressing, Italy said, why not me?
So you have seven powers with a permanent veto?
Yes,
is that what you propose?
That's right. 7 permanent members, which will be 3 of the existing members, United States, China, Russia, a single seat for the European Union, And then the 3 new members will be India, Brazil, and Nigeria.
And all these 7 powers
will have
a veto.
Will have the veto, because you cannot have double standards.
All right. And now the next 7.
The next 7 will be, you see, the middle powers have been resisting change, because the middle powers will lose in any formula where some of the neighbors become permanent members. So now the 28 next most powerful states in the world, selected by a combination of the size of the population and the size of the GNP, will automatically get a seat every 4 terms. 28 divided by 4 is 7.
And then the last layer,
the last layer will be the remaining states in the world. And it's a win-win-win formula.
But in your formula, China and India sit on the same table then? They sit around the same table?
China and India will have to sit on the same table. And frankly, China and India will be equally powerful 20, 30 years from now.
But China doesn't want India on the same table.
Actually, the China doesn't want Japan on the same table.
Are you saying that China is okay with India?
I think China has accepted India and will accept India, because it is not in China's national interest to deny India a seat. And the Chinese, by the way...
How do you say that?
Oh, very simply. The Chinese realize that the rise of China is raising a lot of concerns in the rest of the world. This is a fact.
Okay.
United States is concerned, Japan is concerned, many of the Southeast Asian states are concerned, Russia is quietly concerned.
So is China willing to manage its peaceful rise?
In this process, the Chinese realize that if India gets pushed into the anti-China camp, it's a big loss for China. And that's why, the Chinese leaders have spent so much time and effort to try and cultivate India and to try and achieve a normal working arrangement with India. And your trade has exploded from what used to be less than $10 billion.
It's now about 62 billion.
Yeah, it has risen very, very fast.
But Professor, are you saying then that India is resisting these overtures made by the Chinese, and that we are much more comfortable with being alongside the Americans, for example?
Well,
and that there is a tacit sort of a...
I think I would make a distinction between the Indian media, which, as you know, is very critical of China, and the fact, and the Indian government, which has been very pragmatic on China. In fact, I've been actually very impressed by Indian diplomacy vis-a-vis China, and I
think the Indian government is also very, very cautious about China, because on the border issue, for example, the Chinese have taken back a lot of the promises that they made in 2005. But having said that, are you saying that the Indian leadership must reach out to China much more, because the Chinese also want to do that?
Well, I would say, the way I describe things is look at where your long-term interests are. That's all. And India has a long-term national interest in also having good relations with China. Because guess what? The paradox here is that the other great powers, including the United States, Europe, and Japan and all, will actually find India much more useful if it also has good ties with China.
But let me ask you
add one very important point.
Okay.
Whereas if India shifts to the anti-China camp, the rest of the world will take India for granted and say, oh, India is already in our pocket, we don't have to do anything about India anymore. So for India to use its geopolitical moment, which is there's an extraordinary geopolitical moment for India today, the best way it can do this is by being extremely cunning and having good relations with everybody. And that would enhance the options for India tremendously.
But that's a fascinating thought, Professor, that India should be cunning. You're saying we are not as cunning as we should be.
That was the lecture which I gave.
Okay, but are you saying that India is not as cunning as it should be?
Yes, I think many countries are not as cunning as they could be. But very few countries, by the way, are enjoying the kind of geopolitical sweet spot that India is going through today.
Okay.
India is being courted. Remember this, this was not always the case. Remember the Cold War. Remember that the United States sent aircraft carriers to threaten India because you were invading Bangladesh. So remember, there was a different world when the two largest democracies were arguing and clashing with each other. So right
how
now,
do you stay in this geopolitical sweet spot then?
Oh, by being extraordinarily cunning and clever in the responses. And I think India can do it. And I think right now, if India can, and by the way, India should develop a very close relationship with the United States.
And a close relationship with China.
And a close relationship with China.
Okay.
That's the way you maximize your options. You know, it's like a seesaw, right? If you are in the middle of the seesaw, India, and United States is one end, China's in the other end, you, depending on where you step, you decide how the seesaw goes. So you want to be in the middle.
Professor Mahbubani, thank you so much for talking to Rajya Sabha TV.
My pleasure.
I'm afraid we have to leave it there. We've been in conversation with Professor Kishore Mahbubani, the Dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy of the National University of Singapore. We'll have another global thinker, same time next week. Till then, goodbye and good luck.